how do you draw a picture of consciousness? And I say, oh no, you can't. Well, you can, because you can use a cartoonist's convention of the thought balloon. This is my favorite picture of consciousness by Saul Steinberg, a New Yorker cover of many years ago. And you see that the man, who's a bunch of dots, is looking at a painting by Georges Braque, and he recognizes it. He's got the artist right, Braque, Baroque. This is his stream of consciousness, and off he goes, associations after associations. It's not all words, there's colors and shapes. And if you study that picture, you learn quite a bit about this man's psychology, about what's going on in his head. But wait a minute. It's not in his head, is it? I mean, it's floating up above his head. Well, there's something going on in his head. All those brain processes are going on in his head, the brain processes we've just been hearing about. What is the relationship between those processes and this metaphorical, fictional depiction of them? Because we know that our thoughts aren't actually floating in a little balloon above our heads. If we can tie the metaphor to the literal truth in the brain, we will have a good theory of consciousness. So we have to close the gap. And that's a big gap between the metaphorical truth and the literal truth in the brain. Descartes, René Descartes in the 17th century was really the founder of thinking about consciousness in the brain. And his theory said there's actually two distinct substances. There's the mind, and then there's the brain. And the brain is a physical, mechanical system, material system. And the mind, well, he didn't say it floated nearby, but he might as well say that. He never could quite say where it was. But what happens is that, here's his diagram, the light bounces off that arrow on the right into the man's eyes, which causes the nerves to jangle, which causes spinocerebral fluid to vibrate, which causes the pineal gland to do what? Well, to send a mysterious immaterial signal to the soul. The pineal gland was Descartes' Bluetooth to the soul. And then the soul, having decided of its own free will to point at the arrow, sends another Bluetooth signal back to the body, and that gets the arm to raise to point to the arrow. Now, this is a hopeless theory, and it has been recognized as hopeless by just about everybody for 50 years and more. Certainly in the 21st century, there are hardly any Cartesian dualists left around. Two substances, the mind and the brain. Rather, we think that the brain, it is the mind. The mind is what the brain does. It's a material organ, just as your lungs and your heart are material organs, and we have to explain all the goings-on in the mind in terms of the interactions of those material parts, those 86 billion neurons that are attached to each other and sending all those signals. I want to make Cartesian dualism look very attractive, in spite of the fact I just said it's a hopeless doctrine. But it's still attractive after all these years. So I want to do a little experiment with you. What I want you to do is just to stare at the white cross. And don't move your eyes. Stare at the white cross. Stare at the white cross. Keep staring for another second or two. That should be long enough. What did you see? Did you see it? Okay, you all saw the flag. Very good. How many of you would agree with this statement? The lowest short red stripe is intersecting the black cross, or was intersecting the black cross. Well, if you saw it again, I think you would agree. We could do that, but let's not. We'll just charge ahead. I'm supposing that you would agree that the shortest red stripe was intersecting the black cross. But now, if you said that, I would want to know, what are you talking about? There was no stripe on the screen. So where's this red stripe? No red stripe on the screen. No red stripe on your retina either. Well, maybe the red stripe is in your brain? Well, you might think so. This is a diagram from Frisbee's textbook Vision of a few years ago. The artist who's drawn this has taken license to paint the image of stimulation of the woman upside down and distorted as it is on the visual cortex, on striate cortex. And as you can see, it's split between left and right hemispheres. It's crossed over and it's distorted. And there we see red lips, we see red stripes of her jersey. But that's an artist's license. There are no red stripes on the occipital cortex, and there's no red stripes anywhere in the brain. There aren't. So where's the red stripe? You saw the red stripe. You were talking about the red stripe. It's not on the wall. It's not in your eye. It's not in the brain. Where is it? The Cartesian answer is, it's in your mind. That's what the mind is for. But we have to resist that. And it's hard to swallow, but I'm going to try to show you how you can resist it. There's no red stripe in your brain, but there's a representation of a red stripe. As John Dylan Haynes was saying, it's coded. Remember, he was showing you those pictures from the film, and you saw the decoded version. The coded version doesn't look anything like the decoded version. The coded version is just activity in the brain, and yet it does code for what the person is seeing. There's a representation of the red stripe in the brain. It isn't red. There seems to you to be a red stripe in the world. But that seeming isn't red either. Where's the red? Nowhere. It's an illusion. It doesn't exist. There is no red stripe. There just seems to you to be a red stripe. Now, that's the hard part to accept. But that's what you have to accept if you're going to avoid Cartesian dualism. This may make it a little easier. If you look at the black sort of dots, you may see some rotating motion in this illusion. How many of you see rotating motion? Oh, good, it's working. You never can quite tell about the lighting in these. This is a nice visual illusion. It's called illusory motion because the pinwheels both rotate and stay stationary. Sort of paradoxical motion. Now, in case you wondered, nothing is rotating in your brain. Nothing. However, there is a representation of rotational motion in your brain. There's parts of the motion-sensitive parts of your cortex, the parts that are particularly active for motion, that are active when you look at this. And it seems to you that they're rotating, but there's no rotating. You don't have to have the neurons do a little dance inside where they rotate back and forth for it to seem to you that there's rotation. The same thing is true of the red. There doesn't have to be anything red in there for it to seem to you that there's something red out there. There just has to be the code for it. Seeming. How does this seeming happen? Well, what is it made of? It's not made of anything except information. And again, John Dylan Haynes had that nice diagram of the CD and the little information on a CD, and then you have music. There's information in your brain. All of the seeming is represented, is embodied, there's a vehicle in there to make the seeming happen, and it doesn't have to be rendered in colors or sounds or anything for you to seem to see and hear those things. Well, is there not an inner theater? The theater of the mind? And the answer is no. This is an artist's satirical drawing of some years ago showing what I call the Cartesian theater. Because what happened is theorists gave up dualism long ago, but they kept part of Descartes. They decided there was still a place in the brain where it all came together for the show. It was just somewhere in the brain. So this is this imaginary place, the Cartesian theater. So the light comes in, it exposes the film. The film is then developed and dried off with a little fan, and then it's projected onto a screen, ta-da, where there are two homunculi in there to look at the screen and to appreciate the show. No use having a screen unless you have an appreciator. You've got to have a homunculus if you're going to have, you've got to have an audience, an inner witness to go along with the inner show. There is no inner show, and there is no single inner witness. You know, we've looked in the brain. You know, how many of you have seen the film Men in Black? There's a great scene in Men in Black where there's this giant bald corpse, and they pull him out of the morgue drawer, and Will Smith touches a little spot on his face, and his whole face opens up, and there's a little green man in there who's operating the giant corpse, and that's a homunculus. And he's got two little screens in front of him, he's got stereo vision and speakers, and he's got a lot of buttons to push. We don't find that in our brains, just in case you wondered. There is not a little man in the brain. Well then, here's the moral of the story. The work done by the homunculus in the Cartesian theater must all be distributed in both space and time within the brain. That's what cognitive science is working on. That's what John Dylan Haynes works on. That's what Andrea works on. Various aspects of how this work gets done in the brain. Now, the tempting mistake is one that I call double transduction. I want to just give it a name, make it vivid to you so you know when you're making it, don't make it. What's transduction? Well, it's really translation from one medium to another. So a microphone is a transducer. It takes acoustic waves and transduces them into an electrical signal. A photocell is a transducer. It takes photons or light waves in and transduces it into what? It could be a sound, it could be an electrical signal. The rods and cones on your retina are transducers. They take light in and they give spike trains out. Spike trains are those little activities in the nerve cells. So we just had that nice, that lovely animation with the sort of spike trains moving along on the axons in the nerve cells. So that's what transduction is. Now, here's what I'm saying. When you look out at the world, photons, sounds, they come streaming in and they're transduced into spike trains in your brain. There is no second transduction. It's spike trains all the way through until you talk about it, you remember it, you do things about it, it's spike trains all the way. There's no medium inside the brain where things get transduced back into sight and sound. There's no little band to strike up to play the music again. Hello. Cartesian dualism clearly has a double transduction, and notice it also has a third transduction. Once the brain once the mind in its immaterial wisdom has decided to point, then it has to get its decision transduced back into the land of material activity, and that's a miracle waiting to happen. If there were a second transduction in your brain, there would have to be a third transduction, so that you could act on what you were just conscious of. So the trick is to eliminate the middle ghost. The middle Cartesian ghost, the middle special privileged medium in the brain, which doesn't exist. In other words, you want to eliminate you might call it the medium. The medium being where each of us represents our world to ourselves in that special inner theater. That's just a bad idea. All the work has to be done, and it's done somehow. We're just making progress on it every year with neural spike trains, all the way in and all the way out to the muscle contractions and actions. What lies in the middle is not a pearl of immaterial, immortal soul. It's what we might call a virtual self. It's a self made of information. It's a data structure which can handle information. I've called it the center of narrative gravity, which is a useful term because you know the center of gravity of an object, the center of gravity of this object here is fairly high. I could easily tip this over. It's a point. It's not physically arbitrary, but it's not an atom. It's not a thing. It's an abstraction. It's like the equator. It's an abstraction. That yourself is the center of narrative gravity. It's an abstraction. It's, if you like, a user illusion. But a very important one and a very useful one. It's made of information. Now, is this a good idea? Well, I want to illustrate it with a little joke I made once. It was on a trip with Paul Allen, the Microsoft billionaire, to St. Petersburg, and he had all the guests on his cruise. We all got matryoshkas, little nesting Russian dolls to paint, and then these were auctioned off. And so I painted mine. I bought it at the auction. I wanted to keep it after I'd made it. And you see the outer shell is Descartes saying cogito ergo sum. And then inside that is the white fellow. That's the ghost in the machine. But inside the ghost, there's a robot. That was inspired by Giulio Girello, who wrote an article, an interview with me in Corriere della Sera some years ago. And the headline the next day was, Sì, abbiamo un'anima, ma è fatta di tanti piccoli robot. Yes, we have a soul, but it's made of lots of tiny robots. I thought, yes, that's it. That's right. We have a soul made of information. Some people really hate this idea. My old friend Jerry Fodor says this: if, in short, there's a community of computers living in my head, there'd also better be somebody who's in charge, and by God, it had better be me. That's as good an expression of I think, really Cartesian dualism as anything. And some people hate it even more than that. Voorhees says, Daniel Dennett is the devil. There's no internal witness, no central recognizer of meaning, no self other than an abstract center of narrative gravity, which is itself nothing but a convenient fiction. For Dennett, it is not a case of the emperor having no clothes. It's rather that the clothes have no emperor. Exactly. If you still have an emperor in your theory of consciousness and experiencing something, then you haven't even begun. You've simply postponed the theory because you've still got the conscious emperor in there. Now, some people, for instance, David Chalmers, well-known critic of mine, says just the opposite. He says if you don't have the subject in your theory, you're evading the main issue, which he calls the hard problem. Well, there you have it. There's two views: Chalmers' view of the hard problem and mine, which is that the hard problem isn't a problem. It's a difficult issue, but it's hard for people to imagine. There's no intermediate position. One of us is dead wrong. And that's not settled yet. And you may want to side with Chalmers. I've given it my best shot today. We're making progress on my side of the fence. The global neuronal workspace of Bernie Bars and Jean-Pierre Changeune's Stanislas Dehaene in Paris is a very nice theoretical implementation of this idea. It's what I call fame in the brain. Some neural events become more influential, they have more clout, as we say in America, and they get themselves remembered and acted upon and so forth. Those are the conscious ones. The rest are oblivious. It's not transduction then, it's informational integration. It's coalescence of different elements. There's no need for a show in another medium. If you had a show, then you just have to have an audience, and then you'd have to do the coalescence in the audience's brain. You cut out the show and go directly from the presentation to the taking. A couple of little experiments for you now. When I first saw this painting in North Carolina, Bellotto's View of Dresden, I saw that bridge in the distance with the people crossing the bridge in the light, and I really wanted to see what kind of clothes they were wearing and what kind of carriages there were on the bridge. So I ran up close, took my glasses off. I wanted to see the details in this painting. By the way, the painting is almost as big as it appears on this screen. And as I got closer, I thought, wait a minute, what happened to all those? And the closer I got, the less detail there was. You may have had that experience yourself. It's stunning. Bellotto, with little blobs of paint, had managed to suggest lots of details. People with arms and legs and feet and clothes and hats and shoes. And the beauty of it is, because he was a great painter, my brain had taken the suggestion. But what does that mean? When the brain takes a suggestion, the brain is forming a lot of expectations. Well, how? By painting a little picture in the head for it to look at? No. It's just forming the expectations. How then does it do that? By generating the most likely continuations, the most likely expectations of what would happen next if I moved forward. And as I ran forward, I shrieked because my expectations were violated. They weren't confirmed. The expectations set up by seeing the painting had been violated. How many of you see the reversible Necker cube floating in front of some black discs? And notice that you can put it into two different orientations. You can see it two different ways. It's a famous sort of illusory diagram. How many of you notice that there's also two other ways of seeing it? See if you can see it not as a cube floating in front of some black circles, but as a cube on a black background seen through a piece of Swiss cheese. How many of you can see that now? If you can't, now you can. Now, those are two different representations in your brain. The image on your retina is the same. When you see it one way and you can work at it, you can see it four different ways then. At least actually you can see it more than that. What you're doing is you're changing the representation, the coding in your brain in a way that sets up different expectations. But the expectations don't have to be rendered in paint, in mental paint anywhere in your brain. Because if it did, then you'd have a problem. Because I'm going to show you one more. There you go. Notice that you have no trouble seeing the multicolored cube. But you also don't bother deciding where the color changes behind the Swiss cheese. It's got to change somehow. You just don't go into it. If you had to paint a picture, there'd be a problem. You'd have to decide where to stop using the yellow paint and where to start using the green. But you don't have that problem. You just see it as a cube. You're just seeing part of it. This is called amodal completion. And I have now completed my talk. Thank you for your attention.